There are many inspirational giants who helped build the Christian church. One of the greatest evangelists of the faith was held captive, enslaved, beaten, ridiculed, and mocked. Yet, he was called out of his bondage to be healed. Decades later, he graciously went back into the lion's den, so to speak, where he led his former captors to the Christian faith. The man on my mind today was named Patricius. You may not recognize him by that name, but I suspect that you've heard of him. His anglicized name was Patrick, and on March 17th, every year, Catholics and Protestants alike celebrate his life. Myths are rampant about St. Patrick. On March 17th each year, everyone is a wee bit Irish. Protestants and Catholics alike recognize him as a saint, but much of what people think they know about Patricius is actually myth. Let's take a look at 10 misconceptions or myths about him. The real Patrick is even more remarkable than the mythical figure of popular imagination. Number 1. He was not Irish by birth. Number 2. He was not English. He was, in fact, a Romanized Briton. That's a Celt living under Roman rule. The Angles for whom England was named were still living on the peninsula that would become Denmark. Number 3. He was not born on March 17th. Some scholars think he died on that day. Number 4. The precise years of his birth and death are disputed. There's little debate, however, that he lived at least most of his life in the 400s or the 5th century. Number 5. He was never canonized or made a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. Number 6. He did not chase away snakes from Ireland. Snakes never lived in post-glacial Ireland. Number 7. He never used a shamrock as a symbol of luck. He, in fact, believed in the sovereignty of Christ. Nothing of significance happens without God's knowledge. Number 8. He was not the first cleric to evangelize Ireland. He was preceded by Catholic Bishop Palladius, who died somewhere around 460 A.D. Number 9. Green was not the original color associated with Patrick. In 1783, the first color was adopted, and it was by the Order of St. Patrick, and they chose blue. Number 10. Though trained by Catholic clerics, Patrick did not answer to the Pope, nor was he given financial support from Rome. He started what would become known as the Celtic Church. So you might ask, who was Patrick? Well, he was most likely born near Dumbarton, a town on the Irish Sea near the modern-day English-Scottish border. One of the generally accepted ranges of dates for his birth lies between 387 and 390 AD. That's only a 3-year period of time. He died around 461, about the time of Palladius, and a decade or so before the fall of the Western Roman Empire. His father was a deacon and his grandfather was a priest. At that time, Roman Catholic priests, especially those living on the frontier, were often married and had families. The areas that would become the Scottish border and the west coast of England were certainly located on the Roman frontier in the 4th and 5th centuries. You might note that from around 44 AD to 383 AD, much of the island of Great Britain was under Roman rule. In case you're wondering how England became England, it happened in 450 AD after a Celtic chieftain named Vortigern invited Angles and Saxons into his realm to serve as mercenaries and as a labor source. The Angles and Saxons, who were related to later Danish Vikings, soon dominated the land and had the audacity to call the natives the Welsh, which meant foreigner or slave. As far as the English were concerned, Patrick was Welsh. Around 404 AD, when Patrick was about 16 years old, he and some friends were enjoying the breakers on the eastern shores of the Irish Sea when they spotted marauding Irish pirates sailing toward them. They turned and ran away, but found themselves being snared by another horde of pirates who had already landed. They, along with hundreds of other young Britons, were taken to Ireland and sold into bondage. For 6 taxing years, in which he was repeatedly beaten, ridiculed, and nearly starved to death on a number of occasions, Patrick grew in his faith. When he was first captured, he was not a believer, but the seeds of faith were sown in him by his family. In his anguish, often naked and starving, his father's earnest words gave him solace. And I quote, "Turn to the Lord, Patrick. There is a God." End of quote. As he wrote in his confession, and I quote, "But the Lord spared a proselyte and a stranger for his name's sake, and mercifully assisted me in that affliction." End of quote. Living among pagans or non-believers, his pious conduct brought him even more ridicule from his captors. He was often mocked and called holy boy or holy youth. Still, he clung to his faith that grew in him. One winter's night, while he slept, he had a powerful, life-altering dream. At that time, he was 22 years old and had labored as a slave for 6 years. In his dream, he heard a voice. It said, and I quote, "Thou dost fast well. Fasting thou shalt soon go to thine country." End of quote. Later in his dream, he heard the same voice say, "Behold, thy ship is ready." End of quote. He fled soon afterward and made his way some 200 miles across northern Ireland through the bogs and moorlands of Ulster, which is a northern province of Ireland, to the rocky shoreline of the Irish Sea. When he came out of the woods among the rocks and the sand of the beach, he saw a ship that was taking on board Irish wolfhounds that would be sold in some distant European port. Patrick eagerly sought out the captain of the ship and pleaded with him to be taken back to his family. The skipper rebuked him and his plan for passage. The young man turned away and was headed back toward the woods. Suddenly he heard a voice saying from behind him, "Come back, young man. The captain has changed his mind." When the Lord reserves a ticket for you on a boat, the captain is in no position to cancel it. Now, Patrick's journey back to his family was by no means an easy one. Nevertheless, he made it back to his people, who were overjoyed by his return. Safely back among family and friends, he continued to study the Word. And some 20 years later, he had another dream that he believed was a calling from God. As he wrote in his confession, and I quote, "In the midst of the night, a man who appeared to come from Ireland, whose name was Victorious, and he had innumerable letters with him, one of which he gave to me, and I read the commencement of the epistle containing, and I quote, 'The voice of the Irish.' And as I read aloud the beginning of the letter, I thought I heard in my mind the voice of those who live near Folclody, which is near the Western Sea, and they cried out, 'We entreat thee, holy youth, to come and walk still amongst us.' And my heart was greatly touched, so that I could not read any more." End of quote. Patrick heeded this dream as a calling from the Most High, so he indeed returned to the land of his captors. It's not hard to see why Patrick was inspired by the words of Paul in his letter to the Philippians. For the next 30 years or so, until he died and was buried in Downpatrick in the northern reaches of Ireland, he witnessed to chieftains and their clans. But you may ask, did he have any success? Was he blessed? Well, estimates of the number of pagans that Patrick led to Christ and baptized is over 120,000. He also built some 300 churches across the island. In doing these things, he founded the first church outside the realm of the Roman Empire. The church organization he founded became known as the Celtic Church. 100 years after his death, a Celtic prince named Columba planted Christianity on Scotland on the island of Iona. And missionaries from Iona then planted Christianity in northern England and across Scotland. The Celtic Church lasted in Ireland until the conquering Normans forced its absorption into Catholicism in the 12th century. Another important legacy of Patrick's is the Celtic cross, which is a cross with a circle around the intersection. The meaning of the Celtic cross is not clear, but many scholars believe that whenever Patrick encountered a circle on a tree or a rock, which the Druids drew as part of their worship of the sun, he drew a cross over it. Well, I hope you found the story of how Patricius became St. Patrick inspirational. I'll see you next time here on The Vantage Point.